Darnell Hunt, Director of the Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies here at UCLA, and I'd like to welcome you to our Author Meets Critic session today. We're really pleased to have Joshua Bloom, Waldo Martin here to talk about their new book, Black Against Empire, The History and Politics of the Black Panther Party. Before we get into the program, I want to thank our co-sponsors for this event, and there are a number of them. It's really appreciative for all the groups that came together to make this event possible. The event is co-sponsored by the UCLA Department of Sociology, the UCLA Academic Advancement Program, or AAP, the UCLA Interdepartmental Program, IDP, in Afro-American Studies, the Choices Project in the UCLA Graduate School of Education and Information Sciences, the UCLA Race and Ethnicity Working Group in Sociology, Walter Allen, the Allen Murray Carter Endowed Chair in Higher Education, and Robin D.G. Kelly, the Gary B. Nash Endowed Chair in United States History. So, as you can see, we have a panel up here. We have the two authors and we have two critics who are here to discuss their work. And let me go through their bios now. First of all, author Joshua Bloom is a former fellow at the Bunche Center and a doctoral candidate in sociology here at UCLA. He is collection editor of the Black Panther newspaper collection, published by Alexander Street Press in collaboration with the Huey P. Newton Foundation. He is co-editor of Working for Justice, the LA Model of Organizing and Advocacy, published by Cornell University Press. Current projects include Pathways of Insurgency, Black Freedom Struggle, and the Second Reconstruction in the United States, 1945 and 1975, under contract with the University of California Press. And Power by Analysis, Strategic Research and Worker Organizing in the Neoliberal Economy. Before becoming a scholar, Joshua worked 8 years as an organizer, predominantly in public housing communities in the Bay Area, where he met leaders of the former leaders of the Black Panther Party and began his work on this book, which took about 13 years, from the earlier proposals in 2000 to the present. Over one person here is Waldo E. Martin, Jr., the co-author for the book. He's a professor of history at the University of California, Berkeley, where he teaches courses in African American history and culture, modern social movements of communities of color, and modern U.S. history. Born and raised in Greensboro, North Carolina, Dr. Martin received his BA in history from Duke in 1973 and his PhD in U.S. history from UC Berkeley in 1980. From 1980 to 1990, he taught at the University of Virginia. Since 1991, he has taught at UC Berkeley. In addition to Black Against Empire, he co-authored with Joshua Bloom. He also is author of Freedom on My Mind, A History of African Americans with Documents, just published by Bedford Books, and that was with Deborah Gray and Mia Bay. His No Coward Soldiers, Black Cultural Politics in Post-War America appeared in 2005. Brown versus Board of Education, A Brief History with Documents in 1998. With Dr. Patricia A. Sullivan, he is the co-editor of Civil Rights in the United States, an encyclopedia, in 2000. University of North Carolina Press published The Mind of Frederick Douglass, his first book, in 1985. His next book, A Change is Gonna Come, African American Freedom Struggle and the Transformation of America, analyzing the cultural politics of the modern African American freedom struggle, will be published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2014. And now we're moving on to our discussants. To my immediate left, we have Robin D.G. Kelly, one of our colleagues here at UCLA. He is the Gary B. Nash Professor of American History here at UCLA. His books include Thelonious Monk, The Life and Times of an American Original from 2009, Race Rebels, Culture, Politics, and the Black Working Class, 1994, Yo Mama's Dysfunctional, Fighting the Culture Wars in Urban America, 1997, Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination, 2002, and most recently, Africa Speaks, America Answers Modern Jazz and Revolutionary Times, 2012. And last but not least, we have Alden Morris. Alden Morris is the Leon Forrest Professor of Sociology and African American Studies at Northwestern University. His interests include race, social inequality, religion, politics, theory, and social movements. Morris is the author of the award-winning book, The Origins of the Civil Rights Movement, which I happen to be teaching right now in my class, which won the 1986 Distinguished Contribution to Scholarship Award by the American Sociological Association. He is co-editor of the volumes Frontiers in Social Movement Theory and Opposition Consciousness. He has published widely in a variety of topics dealing with race, religion, and social inequality. He is currently completing a book on the sociology of W.E.B. Du Bois and his role as a founder of American sociology. He presented a talk here at UCLA a couple of months ago about the project. He is working on a volume on the civil rights movement throughout the United States rather than focusing exclusively on the Southern civil rights movement. In 2009, Morris won the Cox Johnson Fraser Award for Lifetime of Research Scholarship in Teaching from the American Sociological Association. He also is a former chair of sociology, director of Asian American Studies, and interim dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Northwestern University. And I understand also a candidate for president of the ASA. All right. So let me say a few words about the format this evening before we move forward. We're going to hear first from the two discussants. We're going to talk about their reactions to the book, and then we're going to hear from the authors themselves, after which point we're going to open up for Q&A. And following the program here, we're going to have an opportunity for folks to have the book signed if you brought them with you. So without further ado, I believe first up we have Robin Kelly.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon. Before I begin, just a few things.
Microphone.
Oh, my microphone. Okay. Oh, I might as well just sit down, but you can't see me. Oh, that's not gonna work. Okay, I'll just sit. And I can't see you. I have my mother's genes. Okay. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I think it's such a small room. But let me just begin saying a few things and some caveats. One, it's really an honor to be here. I've talked to Jonathan about this for a while, and you know, the way it was conceived initially would be like all these people, all these former Panthers come, and now you have us responding. It's hard for me to call myself a critic of the book because I'm very much a fan of the book, and evidence of it is that I do have a blurb in there. And technically, if I were asked to review it, because I have a blurb, it would be like a conflict of interest. But I have a blurb that's really honest and sincere because given the really huge body of work that's been published under Panthers over the last 10 years, I'd say. I mean, I just think about just Alondra Nelson, Donna Murch, and, I mean, the list goes on and on. This is the first real synthesis that tries to take up the full story of the Black Panther Party, and I think succeeds in ways that all the other texts have not been able to do. I mean, there's some very important interventions in particular areas, but in terms of getting a synthesis together, this is really the text. I'm also honored to be here, with Professor Alden Morris, who basically wrote the only book I can think of that never goes out of date. I mean, it's like, it is the key text on the civil rights movement, its origins, and he was way ahead of all of us, in terms of really understanding how grassroots mobilization takes place. And there's kind of a synergy, I think, between his book on the origins of the civil rights movement and this book, because it really does stand at the ground level to try to understand, from people's personal experiences to their engagement in social action, to collective action, to the building of a movement from the grassroots level. So there's a lot of connections. So what I want to do is sort of riff on what it means to read this book today, in these times, and what I've been thinking about. I won't take too much time, though I have to admit that I was trying to reread the book in my office since 9 this morning, and it just threw me. Because it's not the kind of book you could skim, so I'm rereading it, and at 3:30, I'm like, damn, it's 3:30, I'm trying to get my notes again. So my notes are a little bit crazy, but bear with me. First of all, it's interesting to read this book in the context of the current debates around gun violence, right? It's impossible not to think about it. you know, the sort of gun lobby, the gun nuts, if you will. And imagine, like, post-Sandy Hook, what it means for the NRA and other organizations to call for arming school teachers, right? And in the aftermath of the killing of Trayvon Martin and the killing of many in response to the stand your ground laws in Florida and elsewhere, I never heard a single NRA member saying, the black community should be armed. You know, like young black men, or this Cuban American guy who got killed in the driveway of someone else's house because he got the wrong address. And of course they justify these things as standing ground. No one said they should all be armed. So that's pretty interesting. Other thing is, we got this new film that it's at Sundance, Fruitvale, about the killing of Oscar Grant in the Bay Area, which of course resonates very powerfully. For all the discussion at Fruitvale, I hadn't heard a single, I'm sure it's out there, but a single conversation that connects it to the Black Panther Party, which I think is really, really interesting. The other thing which is interesting is to remind ourselves that the Mulford Bill, which was the bill that was drafted in response to the Black Panther Party legally carrying arms, unconcealed weapons, in public, that Mulford Bill was a way to basically strip them of that right. And what's interesting is that the NRA backed the Mulford Act. It's an example of the NRA backing gun control. Not because the politics were different, in fact the politics are the same, which I think is very, very interesting. The other thing which is interesting to think about is the way that the Panthers were such a young organization. This comes out very clearly in the book. These are children, and not just children, but children who actually have an institutional relationship to education. Some of the organizing took place in high schools. Some of the interventions took place in high schools. Some of the interventions in Richmond, for example, which they write so brilliantly about, were about the way teachers were literally abusing high school kids, and the stand they took against that. Now, again, read that against the LA school police and the attacks on young black and brown kids going back and forth to school getting citations. And that's another story that I think is interesting. The book also reminds us that the Panthers, from the very, very beginning, linked police repression to U.S. militarism and empire. Hence the title of the book, but also it's a constant theme. It wasn't that they came to empire and militarism. It was there from the very, very beginning, before there was a Black Panther Party in its formation. I think that's really important to remember, because what it does suggest is the Panthers, Huey Newton in particular's analysis of internal colonialism. I still find, I run into sociologists who think that Robert Browner, who's a wonderful scholar, this is not taking anything away from him, that he kind of came up with the notion of internal colonialism. It was already sort of evident. It was evident in the Black Belt thesis among the left. It was evident in Harold Cruz's writings earlier than that, and evident very much in the circles, intellectual circles, that produced a body of thinking shaped by the writings of Frantz Fanon, who, again, keep in mind that Wretched of the Earth had only been translated in '63. So everyone's reading Fanon in '66, '67. Black Skin, White Mask was translated in '67. So it's interesting that Fanon, even more than Mao, I think, is very, very important as a kind of ideological, philosophical foundation of Panther ideology. No one who reads books, that is, believes that the Panthers were anti-white nowadays. There's still a kind of populace who believe this. However, what I think is striking about the book is their account of the Panthers' rise and SNCC's demise. That to put them together in parallel, because of course they're trying to build this alliance, what they reveal is the degree to which the Panthers' position on class analysis, on multiracial organizing, was so clear at a time when even SNCC wasn't so clear on this question. In fact, some of the, I won't go into it, but some of the comparisons they make are very, very important, which leads me to one question I actually do have, and that is about James Forman. I've always been curious, because I don't think anyone's really adequately answered the question for me. why James Foreman ends up being one on the outs with the Panthers, whereas Stokely is at Army Touré is on the ends. Because James Foreman's ideas are much closer, and and they do talk about this. But I just would like to hear more, just from your own evidence. It may not be enough evidence. Okay, just a couple final things I want to turn to that are kind of substantial. One other thing has to do with community service. Again, to read their analysis of the revolutionary implications of community service, which is probably the best defense I've read, given the fact that this debate continues. I think about reading this book against the way we've seen responses to Hurricane Sandy, Katrina, the LA Rebellion, that in the aftermath of these crises, there's always a tension between mutual aid, community service, volunteerism, trying to build supports that the state's unable to provide, versus the other tendency, which is even much more prominent now than it was in the Keynesian state of the late 60s, early 70s, and that is privatization, corporate for-profit solutions. And so imagine right now there's a debate going on about whether or not Occupy Sandy relief is a radical move, because it's about mutual aid. It's about helping people get whatever needs they met, because the state's unable to do it. And then here I think about how this role of community service, as they argue, has all these possible revolutionary implications. One is part of an older Black self-help tradition in community empowerment, but it also demonstrates the failure of the welfare state, or the failure of the state period, to provide goods and services when people need them. And so free breakfast programs, community health, all this is about demonstrating that the state fails, and that the people actually empowered can provide these things. And of course, this is a really big debate, but then when you get outside the United States, when you think about Hezbollah, you think about Jabhat al-Nusra and Syria, and all these different organizations that actually win support of the masses by providing goods, food, bread, whatever it is that people need, bricks to build things, when the state can't do it. Okay, so I'm going to skip one last thing I want to talk about, and that is the issue that's on everybody's mind all the time. And it's the issue that I think every conversation I've ever had about the Black Panther Party always comes up: decline. Why did it decline? Some people say, why did it fail? Why was it crushed? How much of it was internal contradictions in politics? How much was a cult of personality? How much was state repression? And of course, I think that this book really gives a very powerful answer that considers all these factors, and also considers and reminds us that the Black Panther Party was a revolutionary movement in the Gramscian sense that occupied a revolutionary moment. So therefore, it's not just the Panthers, but almost every revolutionary organization ends up through a series of processes, internal and external, although you can't really separate them so easily, lead to their demise. And so I just want to take that one step further and think about the demise of the Black Panther Party and the demise of the revolutionary moment in the global context. Because when we talk about the failure or the decline of revolutionary movements, we also have to talk about counter-revolution. We think of, and this is the last thing I want to sort of address, counter-revolution, like the revolution, was a global process. You can see a book about the revolutionary imagination in 1968, right? But the counter-revolution was also global. And if you think about like all the victories that we tend to identify with, like the people talk about how Vietnam defeated the United States, the U.S. Empire. Well, yeah, the U.S. lost in Vietnam, but if you think of it from a global perspective, most of the third world lost in that battle. I mean, think about what we witnessed in the 60s and 70s. It was a whole process of destabilization, assassinations, overthrow of democratically elected governments, from Dominican Republic to Chile to installations of dictators in the service of U.S. empire. I mean, this is the story of the 1970s. And as important as repression and incarceration is in terms of a kind of revolutionary, counter-revolutionary movement, or even co-optation, in the United States, we're also talking about the massive dismantling of a welfare state and the social wage. We're talking about the policies of privatization and austerity and outsourcing and displacement, things that the Panthers were pushing against. They were trying to create public control, right, of the necessary social resources, either through struggles with the state or through active volunteerism. And that is the opposite of kind of privatization and austerity and outsourcing, which is about privatizing those. And instead, what we get in the 21st century is the debt becomes public and the wealth becomes private. The sources that we need become private. And again, to go back, it's amazing how everything is kind of turned upside down. Finally, the last thing is what we witnessed in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and right now is the expansion of the national security state. We saw it at the end of World War II. You especially saw it in response to organizations like the Black Panther Party, where even the narrative of black violence justified the expansion of the national security state, right? And so you have that as well as the expansion of the national security state on a global level through the military, through covert operations, through domestic policing and surveillance. I mean, right to this day, they're having hearings and conversations about surveillance of progressive movements in Los Angeles, right? You have the expansion of prisons and the militarization of the border. This is the world that we're occupying right now. So, I hate to end on such a sad note, but what it does suggest is, in reading this book, that if you think about the revolutionary moment and how it came to be, in 1966, 67, no one would have predicted the Black Panther Party. In other words, it wasn't like the objective conditions were perfect for it. On the contrary, this was at the height of the Vietnam War. This is at the height of surveillance and forms of repression, and at the height of kind of reactionary politics. They come into being once Nixon's elected. They exist 2 years before that, but Nixon's election both is a response to that, but also in some ways in spite of that. So what this demonstrates to us is that a revolutionary moment is not something you wait for, but you create. And that's what this book, to me, says. You create struggles against empire, not by waiting for it to collapse, but by ushering it in. And sometimes you don't always win, but you create the conditions for people to think differently about the social wage, about the right to health care, about the right to food and clothes, shelter, and the right not to be killed, beaten, or surveilled. Thank you.
So I'm very honored to be here, to be a part of this conversation. I want to thank Professor Darnell Hunt for inviting me, for running this great center. As far as Robert Kelly goes, as far as Professor Kelly goes, he's a real intellectual hero of mine. The idea that I got there before everybody is simply based on the fact that I'm quite a bit older than he is. So that Clifford Geertz, the great anthropological theorist, advanced the notion that thick description was crucial to building analytic frameworks through which complex societies and cultures could be understood. Such thick descriptions specify many details, conceptual structures, and meanings, so that this conceptual strategy is useful for analysts seeking to provide deep insights into social movements and into phenomena such as the Black Panther Party. Joshua Bloom and Waldo E. Martin have produced an important book on the Panther Party, that is, Black Against Empire, the history and politics of the Black Panther Party. The authors provide a deep, comprehensive description of the Black Panther Party that really has not been achieved elsewhere. There are important studies of the Panthers, but they tend to focus on some particular aspect of the party. Black Against Empire seeks to tell the whole story of the Panthers. To a large extent, Bloom and Martin succeed at this task. The book reveals the party's history and how it unfolded and changed through time. We are introduced to the party's philosophy, its worldview, and its audacious tactic of armed self-defense. We are introduced to various leaders of the party in ways that reveal their humanness, but also laying bare their noble qualities and considerable frailties. The authors show the Panthers' international reach and abilities to make alliances in far-flung places on the globe. So that Black Against Empire dissect gender relations in the party, revealing just how those realities came to the fore and were debated and practiced. I'd never before seen a real discussion of gender in the party as it is in this book. We learn how the Panthers navigated the stormy waters that they encountered when they interacted with moderate blacks and with the white New Left. And this volume certainly spares no mercy when it comes to uncovering the story of repression against the Panthers, where governmental agencies and local police forces murdered Panthers as if they were prized animals captured in the hunt. Such a book, bound from cover to cover with insightful, deep description, is a welcome addition in the literature seeking to understand the tumultuous 60s and the Black freedom struggle. Yet, I argue that Black Against Empire is not good to the last drop. Its theoretical conceptualization falls short of its mastery of deep description. This mismatch results from an analytical choice the authors make. By choosing to focus on the party's political practices as the central problematic, other important aspects of the party travel beneath the theoretical radar, thus providing an understanding of the Black Panther Party that shades toward one-dimensionality. Bloom and Martin made a decision in Black Against Empire to focus on the politics of the Panthers, to focus on the politics of the Panthers, that is, on their tactic of armed self-defense, rather than the party's organizational structure and how it operated. As a result, this study fails to reveal and explore the concrete ways in which the Panthers organized themselves into a powerful force. Thus, we do not learn about the nature of the Panthers' decision-making process. We do not know whether decision-making was based on a consensual model, or majority rule, or a dictatorship where orders emanated from a few at the top. All we can assume is that it must have been done by dictatorship, because we are told repeatedly that mandates were usually issued by one person, Huey Newton, who often borrowed them from a jail cell. And certainly there were times when Bobby Seals also issued mandates. How decisions are made in social movements matter, because they affect the quality of leadership creativity, the level of trust and solidarity between rank and file, and the ability for repression and internecine warfare to cripple movements. Black Against Empire fails to uncover the processes of day-to-day mobilizing used by the Panthers. The big question of how the Panthers successfully recruited people to participate in high-risk activism, including risking death, long jail sentences, were never confronted head-on. Was the rank and file members paid as activists? Or did they have to work full-time jobs outside the party? If they worked outside of the party, did this work consist mainly of hustling and other illegal activities? How might such outside work affect the success or defeat of the Panthers? Given the social background of Panther leaders and followers, why did they select and internalize a worldview shaped by principles formulated by Marx, Fanon, Guevara, Mao Zedong, thus leading them to a politics anchored in an internationalist framework? Why, given that Panthers were shaped by the black community, did they reject black nationalism and Pan-Africanism? In short, the current work does not provide a deep sense of who the Panthers actually were and why they embraced beliefs and behaved in ways that fell outside of the dominant political discourses of the mainstream black community. Black Against Empire advocates a position that the Black Panthers and Black Power movements differed foundationally from the Civil Rights Movement, especially from the Southern Civil Rights Movement. Bloom and Martin argue that the Panthers were a sui generis phenomenon that must be understood in their own terms. The Panthers, they argued, advocated revolution to overthrow an American empire. The Civil Rights Movement, in contrast, advocated reform from within. But can this rock-solid distinction withstand the facts? This distinction between the Panthers and the Civil Rights Movement, in my view, is overblown and does not match the realities on the ground. First, many of the Panthers, especially key leaders, were born in the South and spent considerable time there during their formative youth. Moreover, their parents and relatives who raised them were usually Southern migrants. Thus, future Panthers grew up imbibing Southern culture, kept alive by their parents' generation. Indeed, the Panthers labeled the police pigs because they were familiar with the habit of pigs, because of the paramount role that hogs played in the diet and the economy of Southern blacks. Second, there was significant overlap between important Panther leaders and the leaders of the Civil Rights Movement, especially SNCC. For example, as they show in the book, Kathleen Cleaver cut her political teeth in SNCC, which prepared her for activism in the Panthers. And of course, Panther leaders established, as Robin just said, rocky alliances with Southern leaders, including Stokely Carmichael, James Foreman, H. Rap Brown. Third, the historical record confirms that Black Power politics were born inside of the Southern Civil Rights Movement. Black Power first exploded among black masses on a dusty road in Greenwood, Mississippi in 1966. The point is that Black Against Empire views the Southern Civil Rights Movement statically, freezing it in a straitjacket of reformism. But the Southern movement was a dynamic force, propelled by fluid historical circumstances and the creativity of its participants. Indeed, Martin Luther King, thought to be the quintessential reformer, evolved into a radical activist by the late 1960s, advocating an agenda that could not be fulfilled within a reformist frame. King began calling for redistribution of American wealth and income and the use of radical nonviolent tactics to achieve the goal. In movement circles, King had begun to utter Marxist and socialist influenced visions. The FBI was not far off when it came to view King as a dangerous radical spouting communist principles. Thus, Bloom and Martin failed to grasp the fundamental relationship between the civil rights movement and the Panthers because they believed the Panther Party and its politics were unique, and that comparisons with civil rights is just wrongheaded. So that, in my view, this approach exaggerates the North-South dichotomy, as well as the differences between civil rights politics and the gun-toting revolutionary politics of the Black Panther Party. Even when they acknowledge that Panther initiatives such as free breakfast, free medical clinics, and Black history forums were heavily inspired, not only by the civil rights movement, but heavily inspired by the civil rights movement, Bloom and Martin stopped short of providing an analysis of the deep connections between the Panthers and the civil rights movement, including the significance of the civil rights movement providing the name for the party itself. So let me close by reiterating that Black Against Empire excels at providing deep description and stellar social history of the Black Panther Party, but not deep theoretical understandings of the party. It is telling that while the book consists of 401 pages of text, only portions of 11 of those pages are devoted to theoretical issues and the vast theoretical literature on social movements. Clearly, then, deep description and social history is the sine qua non of Black Against Empire. But with all of that said, it would be incorrect to conclude Black Against Empire has no theoretical message. It argues that political context determined the relative efficacy of the Panthers' armed self-defense tactic. The political context of the times, which included the unpopular Vietnam War, although it was quite popular for a long time, to tell you the truth, but the political context of the times includes the unpopular Vietnam War and the political upheavals of third world nationalist movements, and that those provided the Panthers with vital alliances consisting of the New Left and Third World revolutionaries that made their politics effective for a brief period. Yet, and this is their argument, even that brief period of Panther triumph collapsed because the Nixon administration scaled back the draft and the war and stabilized relations with third world nations. Nixon's administration, they argued, unleashed crippling repression against the Panthers, causing the party to collapse. Those concessions and repression caused the demise of the Panther Party, according to this analysis. But there is much to be done theoretically if we are to arrive at a comprehensive understanding of the Black Panther Party. If I'm correct that the Panthers constituted but a wing of a multifaceted large movement, how do we theorize the relations and developments between those wings and ferret out the factors that cross-fertilize the movement and those that led to internal warfare and movement failure? Moreover, we need an analysis that explores the complex relationships and interactions between processes of mobilization and of organization, and of decision-making, and of depression, and of gender hierarchies, and to try to come to understand how all of those factors interacting shape the growth and the demise of the party. One-dimensional theorizing cannot fully capture the crucial dynamics that determine the trajectory of the Panther Party. There's another matter needing theoretical attention. How did insurgent identities come to be formed and developed among a population of poor, oppressed people who often unleashed rage against each other rather than the oppressive forces? What were the social processes that caused them to direct their rage against an empire and plant the belief deep inside their souls that they could topple the most powerful nation on earth and usher in a utopia of their own making. Perhaps those insurgent identities never fully matured, causing some Panthers to eventually turn on each other, thus aiding the enemy by helping Panthers fall on their own sword to some extent. Oh, there's a great theoretical wonder in all of this. So I want to just close by saying thanks to Bloom and Martin for bringing us to the brink of a greater theoretical understanding of one of the most fascinating and important movements of the 20th century. Thank you.
Okay, Joshua and Waldo, the table is set.
Well, first I want to start with some appreciations. Thank you to Professor Hunt and to Alex and the rest of the staff here at the Bunch Center and to the Sociology Department and other co-sponsors for this wonderful opportunity to participate in this event. I really need to give my greatest appreciation to three of my heroes here that I have the honor to share the table with. Professor Martin really was crucial in my decision to become a scholar and to engage, an intellectual career. And really by opening up the questions that you see explored in this book. And one of the first things I read with Dr. Martin was Professor Kelly's dissertation book, Hammer and Hoe, which just was like, okay, this is the kind of scholarship that I want to be doing. And it really set a model for me. And here at UCLA and working on this book, one of the most formative pieces that has really set up the debates that I engage as a sociologist has been Professor Morris's Origins of the Civil Rights Movement, and really trying to build on but also push further with very specifically a theoretical agenda about how to understand movements and mobilization. So thank you. I want to, Professor Morris, when I knew he was coming, I was hoping that he was going to do this, right? Because
you could count on it.
I knew I could count on it, and so I'm just really honored and thrilled that he, to get a chance to engage this intellectual discussion. And so I want to structure my comments around an engagement of three of the points that Professor Morris made, and talk a little bit about the content of the book in that way. So I think there's three main critiques that Professor Morris gave. I think the first two are basically scope critiques, which I want to agree with, and I'll flesh that out. And the third is where I think we really have a very substantive disagreement that I want to push back on. So I think the three basic critiques that I'm hearing from Professor Morris are basically limits of how much you can do with a book. This is a sociological history, but this is a history. This is a history of the Black Panther Party written in a way that people who are interested in narrative and don't necessarily engage the rigorous methodology and the kind of explicit theoretical concerns of sociologists will be engaging in. And so, we really did sideline the explicit treatment of the theoretical intervention. It's dealt with in the introduction, it's dealt with in the conclusion. Implicitly, it underwrites every page of every chapter. But there isn't a very strong theoretical argument structuring this book, because this is a narrative book, which was really needed. It was needed to have a good narrative history that really tells the story of the Black Panther Party in a way that people could read it, and that would get reviewed by the LA Times and would get picked up by undergraduate classes. And that people that's what we're trying to deal with here. There's two pieces that are missing from that I agree with that Professor Morris brought out. The first is that while we do get into, I think maybe the case was overstated. I mean, we have a lot of personal stories here and a lot of discussion of why people are engaging the party and what their thinking is and what their personal history is. But that wasn't the main point of the project. The main point was really to make sense of the politics and to make sense of the evolution and to put the party in the context of a broader set of political struggles that's going on. And let me be more specific about that. There was a lot of scholarship, that really dealt with the civil rights movement, but a real neglect up until recent, about the last 10, 15 years of scholarship dealing with this later more revolutionary black politics in the late 60s and 70s. And we wanted to really take the party, which was I believe, the lead organization, very seriously and ask a very serious question about that, which is, why in this moment, at the zenith of the civil rights movement, at the zenith of when we shall overcome, and we want to have full participation in America, and we're going to use nonviolent tactics to achieve that. Why at that zenith is there such a sea change in the character of black insurgent politics? Why do the Panthers emerge? While, and a lot of the examples that Professor Morris brought are very, we deal with many of these in the book, the turn to black power, King's turn towards Vietnam, all this. It's not just the party, right? Black politics really shifts, and the center of insurgency really shifts. So why at the zenith of civil rights victory do so many people take up the gun and say, we're going to have a revolutionary struggle? And it's very much not the party. So really wanting to make sense of that question, and I'm going to get back to that in the third part. But we wanted to deal with that in a rigorous historical narrative way. We're working on another book. This book is really driven by the archival documents, and we wanted to be precise, and we didn't want to get lost in there's a lot of people that say a lot of different things. So many people died, and there are so many divisions within the party and the politics itself that the stories about what happened are read through all these different struggles, and it's hard to get a real consensus on a moment without going back to the proximate documents. This is document-driven. We're doing another book that's a local history of the Black Panther Party that's all about the personal motivations of the organization. Now we deal some with the organization here, and the way that I conceptualize practice includes organizational questions, and we deal with it some here, but the real richness of the personal stories and the narratives about what's going on for people at a local level, there's only so much you can deal with in 500 pages. So that's I think a scope issue. The theoretical issue, right? My dissertation book is very much a much more explicit engagement with the social movement debates and the theoretical debates in sociology. So let me jump in briefly. We don't have a lot of time, but let me jump in briefly to what it is that we're arguing and how this story really grows out of that theoretical framework, and what that theoretical framework shows in answer to that question of why so many people turn towards revolution. There was a moment in the mid-'60s where the insurgent civil rights organizations that they had organized the sit-ins, they had organized the freedom rides. People had come out, and it wasn't just a single organization, right? People came out from all over to participate in nonviolent civil disobedience and to challenge Jim Crow. But by 65, 66, 67, right, things have started to shift. And our reading is that what's really changed is largely that there's been desegregation, that the targets for civil rights claims and the targets for civil rights practices in formal segregation don't exist. You can't do civil rights action against poverty. It doesn't. People have tried it. Lots of people have tried it. But it doesn't. You can't do a sit-in. You can do a sit-in against a segregated lunch counter. You can ride in an integrated way on a segregated bus. But how do you sit in against poverty? How do you sit in against police brutality, right? And there were a lot of people asking that question in a very forceful way in 65, 66, 67. By 67, you look at LA, and there was a whole Black Congress of organizations trying to ask this question in different ways, very much having taken up the call to Black Power, right? And Black Power was a question. People were saying, how do we continue, right? How do we continue to build this kind of power that people had to challenge Jim Crow? But how do we take it to the issues of poverty? How do we take it to the issues of political exclusion? How do we take it to the fact that police departments and fire departments are still all white? How do we take it to the fact that there's no Black political representation in the electoral system? How do we take it to exclusion from universities, right? And so there's a lot of people asking this question. And what the party did is it developed a set of practices, not just tactics, but also organizational forms and ways of thinking about it, that was able to capture that power of disruption. And very much they were trying to emulate the civil rights movement. They were trying to say, how do we use what we have? We don't have institutional power to address these challenges. So how can we tap the power of disruption? How can we stop business as usual in a way that gives us the power to address these concerns? And what the party recognized was that there was a real front of this struggle in black communities in police brutality. And that if they could stand up to police brutality and provide a real way to challenge that they would gain a real following. Now, the first thing that the party did was it created very completely legal armed patrols of the police. And by patrolling the police, but with arms, they were able to very directly stand up to the police. Now, this only lasted about 6 months, right? But there was this whole series of armed confrontations between the police and the Panthers, in which not a single shot was fired. And the party built its initial following by figuring out how to disrupt and challenge containment policing in the cities of the North, well, specifically in Oakland, to challenge containment policing in a way that could be sustained, in that case, because it was legal. And as Professor Kelly mentioned, what the state quickly did was outlaw the tactic, right? They said, you can't do this anymore, right? And so what the party did is it took that success and it developed a new set of practices that extended that more broadly. Very specifically, what they did is they said, we're going to arm the people. And we're going to have this idea that we are the legitimate representatives of the black community. We are our own political representatives. So it's the sovereignty idea, right, which grows out of this long tradition of black anti-imperialism, right, that we talk about in the book. And it very much grows out of the civil rights movement. But what they did is they developed this set of practices which created a whole set of confrontations with police, right, that really had to be contended with. They had to be contended with because they made these containment policing practices impossible, right? So you have police departments all around the country who are now challenged in their ability to do the customary policing of black communities, right? At the same time, they situated this in a way where this was very much about self-governance and sovereignty in a way that very much dovetailed with the claims not only of international anti-imperialist movements, right, but of black moderate politics, which was very much facing exclusion, right? So there was a lot of support from black moderate politics, from anti-war mobilizations, and from international supporters who didn't want to see the party killed. Let me try to say what I think this says theoretically, briefly, which is that the movement debate in sociology, right, has mostly advanced two kinds of sets of claims about how insurgent movements develop. And one focuses on opportunity as a destabilization of politics as usual, as if the context is really driving. And as Professor Kelly pointed out in the beginning, right, people are participating. And Professor Morris's book is really a corrective to some of that structuralism in the field, right, because he talks about the important organizing that people are doing. But what happens is that those two processes are seen as independent, right? That you've got people doing organizing work on the one hand, and you've got an opportunity out there in the world on the other. And what we argue is that what's really crucial is the way that the practices are able to take advantages of specific cleavages to draw support despite the disruption. So that's the same in the civil rights movement and the party, right? These are completely different sets of practices on their face, right? But there's a similar logic in between. Whether you're sitting in and say, and you're violating legal segregation, and black folks are trying to buy a sandwich at a white-only lunch counter, or whether you're patrolling the police with guns, either way you're disrupting established social order. And the question is, why could those practices be sustained in that moment? The party built power Not only because they were challenging the police, but because they were challenging the police in a way that they could continue to do, and that they could get support behind it. And the reasons that they could do that had everything to do with the moment. If you didn't have hundreds of thousands of people being drafted to go fight a war in Vietnam that they saw as illegitimate, a lot of the folks who were buying the paper, who were turning out for political rallies, who were defending the Black Panther Party in court, who were providing the resources to fund the service programs, would have gone home. And we know that because we see what happened when the draft was repealed. If black middle class had employment on not only police and fire departments, but access to higher education and access to political office, right? There would have been a lot less pressure to be up in arms when Black Panthers were killed for challenging the police, because those black political organizations never supported the tactics. When Fred Hampton goes and he, takes over a ice cream truck and hands out the ice cream to the kids in the, park, right? The kids in the park loved it, but black political moderate organizations didn't love it. But when Fred Hampton's killed in his bed by the Chicago police, there's a lot of black moderate organizations who feel very threatened because they don't have representation in government. They don't have access to higher education. And they don't have ways to get black folks on the police department, fire department, right? When Algeria has an embassy for the Black Panther Party in Algiers and no embassy for the United States, when Cuba is offering to build a military training ground for the Black Panther Party, right? When the premier of China is meeting with Huey Newton, right, and the New York Times is saying, oh, Nixon shouldn't take this as a disrespect, right? There's international context in which there's a lot of support for at least opposing the brutal repression of the party, right? But as diplomatic relations are mended, right, and Nixon goes to China, and the U.S. starts exploring opening an embassy in Algiers, right? The party gets pushed out, right? So the context is key, not because it was a revolutionary movement, a revolutionary moment in the abstract. The context is key because it made it so that when young black people said, we are going to govern ourselves. If our kids are starving, we're not going to wait for the government, we're going to feed them breakfast ourselves. If police are beating us up, we're going to defend ourselves, and we're going to have our own police force. And those police that are called police, those are imperialist troops, and they ought to get out, right? Those actions could be sustained so long as there was support from a moderate black political establishment, so long as there was a serious international revolutionary movement abroad, so long as there were hundreds of thousands of kids being drafted and their parents, 80% of the Democratic electorate, voting against the draft and against the war, and the Democratic establishment in '68 pushing through a pro-war platform and a pro-war candidate for president, right? So long as those were the conditions, then you could sustain that kind of anti-imperialist challenge and the disruption that grows out. So what I think this shows more broadly is it starts to get at, and I agree with Professor Morris that it's not fully made explicit here, but it starts to get at a way of thinking about the relationship between practice and context, which I think is a crucial corrective to their basic separation as independent variables in current sociological debates. And I hope, in exchange with Professor Morris and the rest of social movement scholars, that we can fully make explicit those theoretical implications in the years to come.
My understanding is that we're supposed to have about 45 minutes for audience panel interaction. So I'm going to keep it very brief. I too want to thank